sesión del máster de Historia del Mundo y la asignatura de la Organización del Estado. En parte es una actividad del seminario del Instituto Universitario de Historia de muchas universidades. Es un placer contar de nuevo con la presencia del profesor Wim Blockmans, profesor emérito de Historia Medieval en la Universidad de Leiden, especializado en historia de Flandes, Holanda, los Países Bajos, los siglos XIII y XVI, con una extensa bibliografía que ahora no voy a citar. Pero al mismo tiempo, sus aportaciones historiográficas son fundamentales en el ámbito de la formación del Estado en este periodo, del XVI al XVIII. Ha sido rector del Instituto Neerlandés de Estudios Avanzados en Humanidades y Ciencias Sociales, UNIAS, es miembro de la Academia Británica, de la Royal Historical Society, de la Academia Europea, de la Real Academia Neerlandesa de Artes y Ciencias y de la Real Academia Flamenca de Bellas. Además, ha presidido diversos comités científicos de evaluación, por ejemplo, el IRC, durante varios años. Relacionado con el tema de la sesión del seminario, destacaremos algunos trabajos, especialmente su libro Historia del Poder en Europa, Pueblos, Mercados, Estados, y principalmente los 7 volúmenes que coordinó junto con Jean-Philippe Genet sobre los orígenes del Estado moderno en Europa. La mayoría de esos volúmenes están en la biblioteca del Instituto y por lo tanto se pueden encontrar. Una edición que hizo junto con Jean-Philippe Genet, además de otro volumen muy interesante, Power Interactions, Futuras Políticas y Emergencia del Estado en Europa entre 1300 y 1900, junto con André Hohenstein y John Mathieu. Blockmans participó en las jornadas que organizamos el 6 y 7 de octubre del año 2016 sobre representación política en el antiguo régimen, impartiendo la lección inaugural. El volumen, que reúne 18 contribuciones, ha sido publicado recientemente por la editorial Routledge sobre la representación política en el antiguo régimen, y el libro nos plantea 18 visiones sobre la representación política en Europa. Por lo tanto, profesor Blockmans, cuando quiera. Gracias.
It is with great emotion that I see such a large audience. I was warned that it would be 10 students and that it would be a very interactive session where I would be grilled, and I hope to be grilled, also by you, by many critical questions, because I'm working on a book on the origins of political participation in Europe before the revolutions, so before parliamentary democracy, if that may be called a democracy. However, the main question is, why did such a system of political participation emerge in some parts at some moments in Europe, and only in Europe? And why did these institutions, where they came into being, think of the English Parliament, think of the Estates General of France, think of the German Reichstag, the Cortes, and so on, why did they change through the centuries? How did they evolve through the centuries? And why did many of them simply disappear from history? Especially in France, but also in the German Empire. So there are lots of questions. Why Europe? And why in some parts of Europe? How? What was their real influence of these institutions? And what did they make of it? Nowadays, I think I have to write such a book because it doesn't exist. To my great surprise, it doesn't exist. The first reference I can show is this book, and as you see it's 40 years old, by a prominent English specialist of English and French parliamentary history. And it's interesting to see what was his cover text, why he wrote in 75 this book, which is a booklet for students. 180 pages, very easily readable, a very great survey of European parliaments until the revolutions also, and he's really the only who starts in the Middle Ages and goes on until rather theoretical date of the French Revolution. But in any way, that medievalists considered that it is one continuous evolution in European history, and that the divide which we used to make between Middle Ages and early modern history is irrelevant for institutions which continue to evolve. And Swedish Parliament, by the way, remained a parliament composed of 3 estates, or even 4 estates, as the free peasants were an estate in parliament in Sweden. And that remained so in Sweden until 1866. So there is a long continuity which in itself deserves to be explained. So there's a lot to be done, but the remark made by Professor Myers is interesting. He says in 75, what you can read, multa sed not multum. All kinds of detailed studies are available, but no general overview. And I would say, this is, he says of his own book, it's a small book, but a very readable book, a very high quality book, but it's not a scholarly study of, with footnotes and so on. The first comprehensive study of rise and progress. Rise and progress. No decay, rise and progress. Okay, I would say today the same statement is still very valid. We had 2 weeks ago an international conference in Valencia, some of us were there, which was also meant to be very international, and we had lots of, as Mayor said, particular studies on special aspects. No explanations why, where, what happened. And I think science is not only about description, but also about understanding and explanation. And, yeah, at my age, I can afford to try to be ambitious. So, one recent book of serious volume and very high quality is limited, is encompassing, it treats in depth, for instance, England, France, and Iberian kingdoms, by Michel Hebert, who is a Canadian scholar. Parlementaire, it's a wonderful title. The verb, talking, parlementer, but he remains limited to Western Europe, excluding Central Europe, so it doesn't deal with the German Empire, to give just that example, and he ends with the Middle Ages. So, great value, great work, but not enough. More has to be done. He, by the way, had a new approach which focused, and that's a little bit trendy, on the performative aspects of assemblies, of political aspects. So the whole scenery and the meaning of the act itself, so the theater of power. That is a new approach, and that adds some value to what exists. And these were his statements, his central criticism on the existing literature as he wrote 5 years ago from now. I heard that some of you are legal historians. The historical tradition is segmented in specializations. And one of them is that of law history, legal history, or constitutional history. And indeed, there is a long tradition of looking at the history of political participation, as I call it, which is a term which I should explain. In which respect is it different from the history of parliaments? It's more than that, it's more ambitious. But much of the history of parliament has been written on the basis of constitutional texts, which are mainly normative texts and not descriptions of political interaction. It's quite a difference to take a top-down, constitution is always top-down, view on a political process and the normative state of the art at a particular moment. We all know that constitutions are just agreements made on a particular moment under stressed circumstances which change very rapidly, and the validity of any constitution remains to be seen over a longer period. So that was a very correct criticism about the existing literature made by Weber. The other 2 points, I also agree fully with it, with him. But many historians have tried to explain the present, and we are thinking within the framework, as the 3rd point says, of the national state as we have them today. So the history of France mainly raised the question, why did the Estates General disappear from the French constitutional history? It existed since 1302 until 1614 and then never was convened again. But it remained in the minds of people because it was reinvented on the eve of the French Revolution. So even an institution which had existed without much influence, and it had functioned under very particular circumstances, even if it had not been convened for 200 years, it remained a political reality in the minds of people which could create or offer the platform for the French Revolution. Because the first attempts were made 2 years before in doubling the number of the Third Estate's membership, for instance. That were small steps initiated a few years before the revolution, but it was too late and not enough. So that teleological vision, so looking forward to what would become the parliamentary democracy, is not a right way to look at history, I think, and I agree with Weber in that respect also. We should also understand the failures. Why did the system work in different ways between countries? Why differently in Poland as compared to England, for instance? There was a diet, a national diet in Poland, and a provincial diet, but why were they so different? And why would it function in totally opposite directions? So there is quite some task for historians, I think. You might even, and I'm very hesitant in this respect, you might even ask the question if the differences we see today in the way in which parliamentary and political systems function within Europe, in which way there is some heritage of the differentiation which existed already before 1800, before the great political revolutions. In other words, and here we can make a reference to Habermas, who stamped that concept of the public space, where public debates could be accepted by all means of communication. There's still one seat free But the price rises as in the aircraft. But it has to be free. But you can put your things here. So I think that there is still a task for historians. And yeah, I was starting with Habermas asking the question if the functioning, even if these assemblies of the 18th century were very aristocratic in their character, they nevertheless created some political platform, a platform for discussion on matters of state. And that was in printed form, that was in the form of discussions, public discussions. In England it took the form of elections, which were regularly held in the counties and in the towns. Elections to send representatives to the House of Commons. So there was really a public space, there was a public debate in England of the 18th century. One can ask the question if the existing system of political discussions, supported by publications, by the print, by meetings and so on, by discourse, if that helped to create a kind of political maturity within the population at large, which did not arise in the same way, let's say, in the German Empire, or in Italy, or in Poland. So, if you look at the map of, the political map of Europe today, this question may be relevant. And it is an open question. But as a historian, I think I should try to contribute to understanding the present.
What do you mean by political maturity? What do you mean by political maturity?
Mature.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
My grandson can answer to that question. He's 15 and he told me yesterday that in schools they were discussing the issue if voting rights on the national and local level would have to be granted to people from the age of 16 onwards. And some were in favor and others were against, of course, and that was what they meant with maturity, sufficient capacity to be aware of the problems at stake, information and capacity to have an independent judgment about these issues. I think this is a very problematic notion if you look at the results of recent political participation in England, the United States, or most European countries. But I will not, this is a discussion to be followed up afterwards, but it is just a challenge. As historians, I think we have a message to talk to the public at large, and I will try to write a readable book, not a footnotes only. So, yeah, here I numbered up a number of ideas in which the present approach of political participation would have to be different, perhaps, and I didn't write it down here, but I should first make clear what I mean with political participation, which is in my title of this speech, rather than parliamentary history or history of the Cortes, or the history of the estates and so on. I think participation is broader. It includes not only the institutional form of the political debate within a parliament or cortes or assemblies, not only on the national level, but down to the local levels. I gave the example already of the elections held for each session of the House of Commons in England in the early modern period. For each session there was an election and an election campaign where in many cases different candidates had to present themselves and were campaigning in competition to get the seat in the House. So that is a form of political participation, and I think the most far-reaching, I will provide figures about it within 45 minutes at the end of my talk. We have, for England, we have a wonderful documentation about political participation, and I can tell you 23% of the male adult population had the possibility to participate in the selection of members of the House of Commons for the counties in England in the beginning of the 18th century. At the end of the 18th century, due to the rise of the population, it was a little bit less. But that is the highest percentage anyhow, which has been reached in Europe of the Ancien Regime. And uncomparable. So, and in that respect, the fact that the House of Lords is still unchanged with its 146 members, that is being compensated by the high political participation. But the notion of participation includes all forms of political agenda setting, political expressions, including also not only the civilized debates and political campaigns for elections and so on, but also protest movements, rebellions. I can be expelled from this country. Rebellions are forms of expression of political views which can change the constitutional setting. So we have to understand also changes in the constitutional settings thanks to the pressure by all forms of expression of political views in the population, be it by mass movements or publications, even political doctrine and so on. So that is a very broad concept, but I think it has more to tell us than the purely constitutionalist tradition which Hebert, for instance, was criticizing. I already mentioned that the traditional splitting of our discipline by chronological periods has its limits for an institution or types of institutions that came into being in the 13th century in Western Europe, in the 14th century in other countries in Western Europe, in the 15th century in Central Europe, in the 16th century in Russia, to disappear in the early 17th century. So there is continuity, as I mentioned, in Sweden until 1866. So isn't it relevant to see how these institutions, once they have come into being, how they evolve? There I come back to the expression used by Professor Meyers, and he said what he wanted to do is to see their progress, okay, their evolution. A political system is not only based on the constitution, there are many forms of expression of political views. They may be institutionalized or not, and they may be institutionalized in various forms. Theater can be an institutional form of expression of political meaning. That was the case as far as I could understand for much of Chinese and Indonesian theater. Maybe still the case. Okay, but the next agenda, I think, is that we have to take into account a political system functions within a society. Politics is dealing with antagonisms in society. So each complex society has tensions, has conflicts, and politics is a way of conflict solving within societies. And the more complex societies are, the more diversified, the more complex you can expect the political expression of the settlement or the management of such conflicts should be. So we have to look at the social and economic basis of society if we try to understand the political system. If I made a contrast between the Polish Diet and the English Parliament in the 18th century, it is obvious that we are talking about very different types of economy, very different social structures, and without understanding these differences we can't understand the functioning of the political system there. And one of the key factors to which I will return several times is population density and their concentration into major cities. That makes a huge difference. I will come back to that. Not only population, but of course, major cities not only concentrate people, but also capital. Capital in all the forms, material capital and human capital in the sense of knowledge, organizational capacities, control on the environment, and so on. So in that respect, the notion of concentration of capital is to be added to the concentration of people. Don't hesitate to interrupt me if I'm not clear, so feel free. There is political participation is allowed here. And yeah, of course, but this is a path which is not so new. We have to look at the role and position within society of the representatives themselves. But that is a tradition which especially has been developed in England thanks to gorgeous source materials with the prosopography of the members of English Parliament since the Middle Ages until the present day. That's a huge endeavor which has been launched in the 1970s, and there's meters of biographies of all members of English Parliament. That's what they call a prosopography, short biographies, but on a category of people, in this case members of Parliament. But it matters. It's a little bit much to get grasp on the material, but yeah, we have it. Oh, I'm making a statement here. That's a personal viewpoint, namely that history teaching has been misled over the centuries by the propaganda monarchs have always made for their own sake. They have stressed by all means, including art, the glory of their dynasty. It's still going on now. While pretending they are serving the common good. What dynasts have been doing, in my perception in European history, is to make war for their dynastic glory. And war is, I think, the single factor which the greatest impact on the history of political participation I can perceive now. I'm just inventing this sentence now, but the idea that war was the main activity of states from the 13th to the 18th century. The budgets of state were by far intended to serve war purposes, not only directly by paying for warfare for the soldiers, for the armament and the navy and so on, but also to pay the debts created during the war. Because monarchs wage wars, that's still true today. They know where they begin, they decide themselves about the targets, which are nearly always dynastic ambitions, not the common interest of the people. If you can name a few counter-examples, I'm eager to listen. But most wars were waged on the initiative of monarchs for their own glorious reputation, but the cost, of course, remained not limited to the direct expenses for the military apparatus, but also for the debts created, the public debts created to finance these wars. You know, when a war begins, you never know where it ends and when it ends. And dynasts have been absolutely irresponsible, and also early 20th century dynasts were absolutely, and even parliaments, absolutely irresponsible with regard to the financial consequences of the wars they launched, and including the First World War. Let's be clear. But I can argue about it in the discussion. So that's my point about the monarchs. We have been misled by the benevolence, the ideology spread by the monarchs, that they are acting benevolently. No, they are not. And they have, now I'm making broad statements, you can criticize me, please, to keep me on the right path, but they couldn't act alone, of course. They had their friends also in the representative institutions, namely two categories of people supported warfare. The aristocracy, because that's their business. The champions in that respect are Wallenstein and Tilly, who became high noblemen, but in fact were major military entrepreneurs. But that's just the most famous cases, but in general, nobility of all ranks profited by their role in the armies. They could make careers, they could be generals, they could be military advisors at court, so they were, that was what became the nobility, that were the warriors in European society. Yes? So that's logical. They were advocating their own only competence, namely making violence. And the second category of supporters of warfare were the creditors, those who lent to the crown and took the rent of these loans for the state. And that were, even in a commercial republic as Venice or Genoa or Holland, that were even urban bourgeoisies. They took rent from the state deficit and earned by buying the credit papers for the public debt. They took rent from it, and that rent was well, a nice source of income, but increased, of course, the cost for future generations of people, without the possibility of any form of political participation to block that mechanism, unless those interested participants, nobility and urban bourgeoisies, worked in their own advantage. So, well, I'll come back to the last. I have 24 screens, and this is number 4. Well, I've already said most of it, that has been said. Yeah, we have to take into account that there were circumstances where something came into being. Think of northern Italy in the 12th, 13th century, forms of representation between that very highly urbanized region and between all these cities, because there was a common enemy, the German emperor, walking around and trying to besiege Milan and so on. So they formed, you will recognize the name, the Lombard League, la Lega Lombarda in Italian. The name is still used. And that was a defensive league of cities. Why did not arise from that source a form of parliamentary representation or cortes or whatever, assembly? I think for the simple reason of the size and the concentration, the extreme concentration of population and of capital in a few very big cities, the biggest of the time. In 1500, Venice, Milan and Genoa were cities of 100,000 or more, or nearly 100,000 inhabitants. And the next level of urban size in the 12th, 13th century was half of that size. So there was a very strong discrepancy between the top of the urban hierarchy and the rest. The effect was that the major places, Florence, Genoa, Venice and Milan, tended to dominate the smaller cities and were successful in doing so. There was no basis of common understanding. Cremona, which is at 30 kilometers from Milan, could not come to an agreement with Milan for the simple reason that Milan didn't want to deal with that minor issue that is something you dominate if you have 100,000 people within your walls. So in the place which was the most developed of Europe in the later Middle Ages, in the time when parliaments arose everywhere, not in northern Italy, because of its high development, without, I would say, a monarch. Yeah, as long as there was a German emperor with an army around, yes, and only then, but from the death of Frederick II onwards, 1250, it were the major dominant cities which did not want to negotiate with the smaller. There was no form of regular assemblies within the contadi of Florence, of Venice or Milan. There were no forms of political representation. There were bilateral relations, which were relations of dominance. And the term dominance was used in the period itself. It's not a historical term, it is a term used in the sources itself. Okay. No, you are not supposed to see this. I also point to the fact that in the historiography, monarchs are nearly always presented as those who initiated negotiations with subjects because they needed money or because they needed recognition as monarch. Some monarchs were very qualified for their job, we could say. That's a normal biological event. Or there was this, a dispute about the legitimacy of the succession. That's a very regular issue. So there were many situations of a critical position of the monarchy. And then, of course, monarchs were seeking support within among their subjects, and then addressed in the first place to the mighty people, the barons, the magnates, and so on, the nobility, the clergy, because those people could write and think, and if needed, from the 13th century onwards, also from citizens, because they could also contribute, militias or money. But there is also, and that's what I try to point out here, a form of self-organization, such as the Lombard League was self-organization, bottom-up. All these cities in Lombardy organized them, collaborated to raise an army against these German emperors, who tried to reduce their autonomy and so on. But the same happened in the late 13th century between three very small valleys in Switzerland, when there was some opposition against a small family called Habsburg. And Habsburg is in origin a place west of Zurich, a small mountain, nothing more than that. And yeah, thanks to the geographical location, the Swiss peasants could throw out these Habsburgs just by throwing a few stones on their heads, and with their armies and so on. They couldn't move on horse and so. Geography helps to understand the bottom-up creation of a confederation in Switzerland as it still exists. There are more examples of what Thomas Besson, a specialist of Catalonian and Catalan and Southern French late medieval history, he called that associative power. The power of communes collaborating, working together, not on behalf, not on the initiative of a king, but against a monarch or an aristocracy like the Habsburgs, that were simple counts in the 13th century, when the first confederation of the three valleys was created in Swiss being, by the way, one of the three. Cities in Catalonia, but also in Languedoc, in Flanders, and the German Hansa is another example. This is another cleavage traditionally made in our discipline. The Hansa is mainly known to economic historians as an association of commercial cities in northern and western Germany and around the Baltic Sea. But what they were doing was to form associative power, because to manage their trade, long distance trade, with England, with Flanders, with Portugal in the 15th century, and deeper south even, into the Mediterranean, in the 16th century. It was not an area where there was a king. The German emperor first, since 1250, the emperor did not represent a real power anymore. Second, the princes in the neighborhood were manifold, because it was a very extensive region, so they had to deal with many princes. So the organization was an economic network, not a political one. So we have to think in that sense. There are different reasons to get a level of organization which is not always that defined by the boundaries of kingdoms. The boundaries of the Swiss Confederation continued to grow until the 18th century. The number of participating entities grew from 3 to 16. From bottom up. But the Hansa can be seen as a form of political participation because trade can only function when there is a level of security, physical security, no violence on the seas or on the roads, and protection to be treated in a way which can be planned, which allows to calculate your profit, to know your profit margins and your risks. So a merchant wants to calculate his risk and to reduce, of course, the risk of being seized by whatever power wants to be reassured about the conditions of his trade, and that is dealing with the powers that be. He may be a Duke of Pomerania, or a King of England, or a King of Portugal. So, in that respect, political participation can work in bottom up or top-down directions, and the whole historiography has been very much impregnated by the top-down vision. Okay, and we have to try to explain differences. This is, of course, what I shall continue to say. I'll try to simplify by images, and images are here meant to be concepts. By the Lombard example, the example of northern Italy, northern and central Italy, I try to show if there is no countervailing power, then dominance by the mightiest prevails. That is, for instance, also the evolution of the Polish political system in the 17th, 18th century. The king was emasculated, figuratively, and cities were of no avail. They were so small and so marginal that there was only rural power, aristocratic power. And as we all know, about 10% of the Polish population belonged to what they called the kind of gentry, lower nobility. But the real power was in the hands of the magnates, the great landed owners. But they were still rivals without a challenge, without an enemy in the person of the king, because they had taken all the power away from the king. That explains the non-functioning anarchy in that situation of the Polish noble republic, as it was called. So that's why I'm insisting on the concept of to understand and to see the rise of political participation. There has to be diversity of interest, and interests which have an independent source of power, be it in land or in trade or in industrial production or in mining industries, whatever, but a kind of power, or in maritime trade, a source of power which is specific for a particular entity in that society. And there are specialized sectors in the economy, of course. So countervailing powers in which a monarch plays a role to balance these powers. The clergy, I didn't add any indication, because the clergy is, of course, penetrating everywhere in Ancien Régime societies. What matters here in traditional rural societies, and that's, of course, the majority of pre-industrial Europe, per definition, where, in general, less than 10% of the population is non-rural, living in cities. So what really matters is the role of the aristocracy, the great nobility, and the lower nobility in the form of the gentry. They exploit, of course, massively the peasantry. There may be some external relations with primitive agriculturalists and hunters and gatherers. For instance, the Baltic trade was in consistent part fed by the trade in furs and other materials from the woods in Russia and in central Poland. So that's what I call here the hunters and gatherers, but I also include primitive agriculturalists. Cities are a small factor, but really what matters to understand a political system is how do these relations function. Functions, the cities, can they really play a strategic role? That can be the case due to very particular geographical conditions. Think of, for instance, the location of a city like Copenhagen, at the straits of the Baltic. They could control a little bit further a small strait, small 4 kilometers width, but difficult to navigate because of the streams. It was easy to levy tolls there. So that tolls were controlled by the King of Denmark. For centuries it was a very important source of revenue, but also a facility for the merchant class in Copenhagen. So in that respect, the location within a particular geographic setting plays a role. I will try to complicate this picture. These are very elementary relations, but if we try to understand the types of relations, we can get a step further, I think. We also need to think in density, as I said. I don't have figures about capital concentration and capital accumulation. It would be wonderful if a person would try to do that for pre-industrial Europe. Then how much capital is being accumulated in 1700 in the city of London. We know the population figures. Jan de Vries, an economic historian, who was a professor and still is, I think, in California, Berkeley, calculated already long ago, 34 years ago, and published it in a book at Cambridge University Press, a way to express figuratively and also by calculation the density of population, not within political borders as we see in our traditional atlases, no, on the geographical realities. What he did is to see at different moments in time, between 1500 and 1800, what is the size of the population in cities, how many people live in the cities above the level of 10,000 inhabitants, to make the whole endeavor comparable. To look at the biggest in the year 1500, where he starts, because of, he couldn't start earlier because of the availability of statistical data. In 1500, the biggest city in Europe was Venice, with maybe 120,000 inhabitants. He took that data for all the cities as he could calculate them with at least 10,000 inhabitants. And then he added to that the distance between cities. So, distance from Venice to the nearby big city, Padova or Brescia or whatever, the density. So the distance of big urban centers. And that leads to this, that are percentages. In 1500, the concentration of big cities is, that is what we already knew, of course, but here it is calculated, concentrated between Milan, Genoa, not Florence, and Venice here, in the Lombard plains, the Po Valley. 80% of the highest concentration around Venice. 80%. You have it in a small area around Naples, and you have it in a somewhat less small area in the southern Low Countries. And we will later on show the similar operation de Vries made for 1750. He did it at certain moments to see the shifts in the urban concentration. I think that is a very important way to look at the phenomenon of urbanization. And it shows, of course, at a particular time, the relative emptiness of small size and big distances between cities of less than 10,000 inhabitants in the regions of central France, central Empire, most of England, 30%, only London will make the difference there, and 50% in northwestern Europe as the density here around Venice. So that's a way of looking at that phenomenon, not a single city alone in itself, as we tend to do, but density, concentration. And in the present state of information we can only assume that population concentrations of that level, I mean above 10,000 inhabitants, self-evidently these cities needed to be differentiated, socially speaking, and to concentrate high levels of human and material capital. So, human capital, skills, artisanal skills, the capacity to produce high-quality goods, and also concentration of intellectual skills, highly specialized activities such as expensive products can be expected to have a market and also a production capacity, especially in larger centers. Is this clear as an approach? We can only assume that big cities in population numbers also include the highest concentration of human and material capital. For the present day, such calculations are available. So we can assume that the same logic applies to pre-industrial cities, but this is not yet proved for pre-industrial societies. Is that a clear reasoning? And that is essential, of course, to understand, again, the relations between the social classes in that mercantile environment of larger urban areas, the densely populated urban areas, have a different social and economic profile, which have a different political system than those areas where the population density is low. And think of all the implications in the sense of the difficulty of transportation, communication, but also political exchange. If we think about political participation and think that there were forms of representation in Russia around 1600, it's not difficult to understand, with the size of the country and the extremely low density of the population and the still relatively small number of cities, the capital Moscow could be very big, 50,000 inhabitants certainly around 1600, 1700. But yeah, you have to travel 300 kilometers to see another city. So that's what we mean by the lack of capacity to concentrate the political movement based on urban interests in such an environment, and so the lack of interaction, political interaction, which is the basis of what we see as political participation. Yeah, you will interrupt me to allow me to have a drink on your health. I've been talking an hour already and not halfway. It's always like that. I will never learn it, it's too late. Now I have a few modifications on the same scheme. it's the same idea, and now you will understand the game. This is the same idea, but applied to northern Italy, as it still continued to exist in the 16th century, 17th century. It remained dominated by metropolises which incorporated the aristocracy. The aristocracy in Italy, since the Middle Ages, was integrated in the city, and the urban patriciate was integrated, impregnated the contado, the environing landscapes, rural landscapes, invested in the land and got noble titles and so on. So there is no opposition as it existed in many other countries. So the metropolises are still there. Naples in the 17th century is the only very big city in southern Italy, just as Palermo and Messina are dominating in Sicily. So it is still a relevant model of interpretation, and to see that metropolises, they don't want to negotiate with small cities. Why should they? If they can dominate, they will dominate. And they have the means to do so, as there is no opposition from, I didn't forget the monarch. He simply, if he exists, he's puppet. Monarch can be excellent puppets, we see it every day. Of course they are all exploiting the peasantry, of course there are relations with the lesser developed economies, and what is essential to understand the role of any metropolis is that they are linked and central in, I should not use the word international because it's irrelevant, but interregional, probably mostly intercontinental trade networks. Yeah? Already in the later Middle Ages, it's intercontinental, from Italy to Northern Africa to the Levant, which is West Asia. So it is intercontinental trade networks are essential to understand the huge concentration of capital in a city like Venice. And they could maintain it until the 17th century. Genoa still was the banking center in the 16th century, although the Atlantic trade had taken over already. So this is a model. Another area with another set of variables, but the same way of thinking, I hope. What lacked in the Baltic area was the very high concentration as you see it in northern Italy. The largest cities in the Baltic area in 1700, Danzig, Gdansk, at the mouth of the Vistula River, where Lech Walesa, who raised his voice these days, was at work. Gdansk was the largest, Lübeck a little bit less, maybe 25,000, Gdansk 30,000. And we are talking about 1700, at a time when Amsterdam had 200,000 inhabitants. And London was well on the way to go towards 500,000. So, what I call a polycentric urban network. There is no dominant force. No monarch who can dominate. There are lots of princes around, but the economic region of the Hansa has to deal with the King of Denmark, the King of Sweden, the King of England, the Duke of Pomerania, and so on and so on and so on. All these, the great Duke of Lithuania. So all these powers were partners which dealt on diplomatic level with the Hansa in the 16th century. Why didn't the Hansa continue to exist? For two reasons, I think. For macroeconomic reasons, namely the Baltic region was overshadowed by the North Sea. Second, Amsterdam took over the whole Baltic area, together with London. They took over the whole trade, domination, and the other reason being state formation, namely the state power from Sweden, for instance, became stronger as a partner than it was, let's say, in 1500. So that is a way to look at it. There was an international, even intercontinental trading center, but yeah, here was the, yeah, I named two factors why the Baltic system with the polycentric structure without a single dominance didn't continue to work. Well, the stronger centers in the West took over economically, and state formation took over the political role in Denmark, in Sweden, but also in the northern, the King of Poland, for instance, who also recuperated Lithuania and so on. Even Peter the Great became a power in the 18th century, so even Russia. So monarchies took over the political role and overplayed the economic interest as represented by that very interesting scheme organized by bottom-up organization, associative power of mercantile, essentially mercantile interest. Yeah. Should I stop at a certain point, or can I go on? Are there issues? You say another scheme. Well, I amuse myself in this way. Think about the time I spent at my desk to draw these things. The system of countervailing powers, and in the two previous, Italy and the Baltic area, there was no center. I insisted, you see the need to negotiate when there are countervailing powers which all have their own power bases and need to talk to each other in their common interest. All the participants see an interest in dealing with each other rather than fighting all the time. The most primitive is of course to fight like animals. Men are animals, of course. But yeah, they learn sometimes to talk. Sometimes. And then you see such combinations, just a combination of what prevails. And I think such a model, it may look a little bit fuzzy, but it can help us to understand why in England, where there was one metropolis in the 18th century, London of course, there was a strong aristocracy. There was a clergy, it was rather dependent, but the bishops had their seats in the House of Lords, so they had a voice, political influence, and not to underestimate also juridical influence, the House of Lords. There was a metropolis, there was an aristocracy, there was a monarch. It could be beheaded every now and then, but nevertheless there was a monarch. And they returned after a few years of republic. They returned to a monarch. There was a gentry to be elected as a representative of the 36 counties in the country, and all of them had relations. The monarchs, the aristocrats, but of course London in the first place. Smaller cities also, they had relations with the intercontinental trade work, which was essential to understand what England was in the 17th and 18th century. And of course, as usual, they were exploited. The less developed areas in the world, well, also in other continents, and their own peasantry, because that had no voice. So, and I think I can make now a few giant steps. I think we can understand expansion of representative systems, broadening of political participation as a form of social emancipation of rising classes, rising social class. Why rising? Because of population growth and economic growth. If that is true, to understand why in the 13th century, after 3 centuries of population and economic growth in Western Europe, urban interest became involved in political decision-making in one form or the other. If that is true, the opposite may be tested, and here I'm trying to be new. I'm astonished that nobody made the argument in the opposite way. Namely, what happens if there is population decrease and economic stagnation, as it happened in the second half of the 14th century, 15th century, and again in most of Europe in the 17th century. Well, my suggestion is, and it's more than a suggestion, here empirical proof is massive, that is a period when, where they existed, all the forms of political participation, it may be on the level of craft guilds in cities, on the level of provincial assemblies or national assemblies, at all levels there was a reduction of political participation in the period of population decrease. In that period and in those regions. And the next step then is to ask, and is that a general trend, so that can be called a correlation, maybe too simple, can we repeat it? Are there instances where there is a period of population growth and economic growth, where there is again a tendency to get more access to decision making and more interest to be represented on a political level? Yes. And then I will jump to population growth triggers, that's my thesis here, triggers emancipation, broadens political participation, and the opposite. Yeah, also in 2 directions. Okay, that's the reasoning here. Yeah, I will have to jump. This is no secret, you can have the screens if you like them. I will jump this, jump that, I come back to that. But here, I promised Jan de Vries's map of urban density in 1750, so beginning of the industrialization process. And then, of course, London was the largest city, 100% is here. And where are the highest levels? The next highest levels, 50%. There's no 80% level in the mid-18th century. But the North Sea area, well, 80% that's the Parisian, but only the region around Paris, because of the sheer size of Paris, again, the capital. But then the whole North Sea, Northwestern Europe can be seen as the next highest level of urbanization, at 50%, and then the old centers still reach that same level here. New centers came with some comparable levels. But what strikes again is this density is a form to see what we mean with concentration of not only people, but also of capital. And now, if the British Isles, and as we know also the Low Countries, had a population growth which in the 16th century, 17th century different significantly from the European average, namely double. So it was an anti-cyclical demographic tendency in these two regions as compared to all the other countries of Europe. Anti-cyclical in the sense of double the average, and even stronger contrast, triple or even nearly 4 times the general level in the 17th century for the rich islands. If that is the case, then my reasoning goes in the direction, and here for that period, the period of the 18th century, we can calculate the per capita income in these two highly urbanized regions, and we see indeed that population growth also is being expressed in the case of England. This is this full line with some delay in time as compared to the Dutch Republic, which was earlier and in the 18th century already decreasing in income per head of the population. Here we come very close to the evaluation of the accumulation of capital, human capital and material capital. And for England we have very special sources. We can calculate, it has been done by a statistician, it is well known. He's the father of a law, an economic law, the law of King, which is a law about monopolizing products for which the demand is not elastic, such as grain, or in our present world, oil. That Mr. King calculated for that year on very solid basis, that has been studied at length, the social composition of the population of England, not only by social class, the size of the households, but also by income. So we can calculate the representativity of the composition of the English Parliament in that period. And that's the only country for which that is possible on the basis of the source which exists. And in the end, we are all dependent on source materials, and also for England this is a unique source, just as Doomsday Book is unique for the population calculation in the late 12th century, this is it for around 1700. So this is a unique source, it's well studied. But if we now see who is sitting in Parliament and what is their income per capita in pounds, you see there is already quite a difference on the basis of that statistic information between the lords and the gentry, and then what he calls, Gregory King, the freeholders, so the peasants who own their own plot of land and their own enterprise. He calls them the better sort. They earn per capita 13 pounds, and then the farmers, a smaller size, and everything else has a lower income. That are the main classes. The farmers is the lowest level of income, with a voice in the choice, in the election of members of the House of Commons in the counties. Yeah? So they have a voice, there is a level of income required to be entitled to vote for the member of Parliament, of the House of Commons, for the county. And that income level can be reached by farmers. So, this is the percentage, as calculated by King, of the persons who, he calls it, increase the wealth of the kingdom, and those, in his perception, decrease the wealth, so increasing in his perception is a large minority, but to be eligible, to meet the criterion to be a candidate, to be elected in the House of Commons, you needed to hold an estate and remain with such an income. So you had two levels based on property for active and passive voting rights. To be elected, you needed for the counties £600 income, and for the small towns, boroughs, called half of it. Okay. And so I come to the electorate. To be allowed to vote for a candidate, you also needed a particular level of income, and those people represented 23% of male adults. 1780 years later, that was sensibly less because of the population increase, while the political system remained the same. Yeah? And that changed only in 1830, when the distribution of electorates was changed by the constitution. So it went on that basis by ongoing population rise in England until 1830, the political structure remaining the same, the number, the percentage of voters, possible voters, continued to decrease. But then came the change of the constitution, where that was adapted by rearrangement of the districts. And then there is, on the basis of that study of parliaments, we can also see there were elections to be held in the counties for the representatives of the House of Commons, but there were many cases where there was only one single candidate. One single candidate, then no vote, no elections were needed. So in 20% in the beginning of the 18th century, there were no elections held. On the other side, you could say in 80% there was competition for the seats in the House of Commons, which shows that there was very active in those 80% of the districts, voting districts. In 80% of them, there was competition, and there was a political debate, and there was campaigning, and there was, of course, also all kinds of corruption, just as today. Candidates offering beer to all the people in the village and helping their clients, of course, and being available for everybody to help them, and so on. Of course, there were persons, there were people. But England was really the exception for two reasons. The documents are extraordinarily available and well studied, and the institution had a continuous existence with a documentation which allowed the whole prosopographical work to be done, and we have more information about the English Parliament as compared to all other parliaments, even that of Aragon. But yeah, by way of contrast, this is what did not exist. I skipped a few of the slides. For instance, France. Let me say in few words, I can return, if you don't obstruct me, to a slide about France. Or about, you can opt, Germany or France, only one of the two. Who is for France?
England.
England has been done.
Yes, England.
Germany or France? There are two other comparisons on France. Okay, I hear that, that there is a public vote for France. This is the kind of manipulation, of course, of all elections. What did I have to say about France? That's what I would say. Well, I will give an idea of both of them. In the Holy Roman Empire, in the 18th century, there were very different, not only tree estates, but all kinds of variations in composition of forms of representation on territorial basis. The Reichstag, that was very vague and far away, but on territorial basis, and that are 153 political units in the empire, different forms, but there was no form of representation in 1/3 of them. No at all. But then there were very different forms. That's what I wanted to say about the German Empire. And then France. Yeah, we know that it was it still is, of course, an absolutist state. But there were territories, periphery. Still very typical French to think in Paris and the periphery, the province. There were former principalities which had been conquered or became in one more peaceful way part of the kingdom. For instance, Dauphiné, Normandy, Roussillon, Franche-Comté, and so on, and they kept their traditional representative institutions. That was the act of agreement. What happened, in fact, as the king has the exclusive right to summon the parliament or the assemblies of a state. Only the king could convene, could summon the meetings. He also decided about the agenda. He could also send them away if they were. Okay, what happened in these territories? He didn't call at all an assembly, so he could govern without. In some cases, where there was a different, some kind of opposition from the estates against fiscal questions, the king sent an army to the province. Simply, sent an army. They marched in the city where the meeting was held, just showing power. That took a time, a year or two, then there came a kind of accommodation. That type of accommodation is what I call here collusion, namely a kind of agreement. Okay, you want the money? Okay, let us do the job for you. We will collect it and give you something. Yeah, collusion. And that became a system which became generalized in France within the estate. I wouldn't dare to say that the Diputations del General maybe have been a kind of a model imitated then in Burgundy in the 17th century or in Artois, in most of these regional parliaments where they continue to exist. They were participating in the fiscal system of the state. Okay, I came to the conclusions, and that were a few theses. I insisted enough, I think, about the need to have different power systems and higher and lower powers. This is a repetition. Concentration in population growth lead to more inclusion, and to come back to the two cases I picked out for the 17th century, Holland and England, not by accident, that were the two countries where parliaments became sovereign in the 17th century. In Holland in the 16th century. Yeah? Not by accident. So my theory is very simple. It works in the two directions. Growth, more pressure on social and economic interests, more pressure towards participation, growth and participation. I'm not saying democracy. The Holland system was oligarchy. Of course it was oligarchy. Maybe at the same level. I'm not sure about it. We don't have the same statistical basis as what I showed for England. But for Holland it was an oligarchy, but in the cities there was a kind of deeply embedded penetration in kinds of guilds. Think of the Night Watch of Rembrandt. That type of organization was a kind of political representation also. But yeah, I will not insist. I can't prove it statistically. I didn't insist too much on the oligarchization. I mentioned it a little bit. Stagnation or decrease leads to less participation and fewer people deciding and taking power on fiscal resources. And then, yeah, I didn't elaborate on this either. Institutions, I can say it in 2 words, institutions tend towards inertia. This is an economic law. Tend to go on in the same way and to become routine-oriented. And in a routine, you see the trends towards what I call here the inclusion into the state system, as the example of the collusion, states organizing the state income, while they were opposed initially to that same level of tax raising. They agreed on the condition that the members of the estates would profit personally from that system, to put it very bluntly. And then, in the end, of course, to come back to my friends, the monarchs, it is obvious that they could strengthen their position, not only in systems where there was a weak parliament, but mainly through the fact of warfare. It was only the monarch who could decide about war and peace. That's what they did. Making war. That was what states' budgets were about. Up to 100%. And in times of war, 200% of the state budget went to war and payment of the debt. And the 200%, that refers, of course, to the doubling of the public debt in a period of war. That has been documented in publications as those mentioned by Professor Alvareda 20 years ago. So warfare increases the fiscal pressure, and the arguments used then generally by in form of legitimation is it is the necessitas, the necessity to help to preserve the dynasty, to preserve the state, the monarchy, and so on. Yeah, and the necessity in the German historiography, there is a strong tendency to say, yes, the 30 Years' War, the 30 Years' War was a real drama in Central Europe. 30% population loss, 30% population loss in one generation. So if you calculate that, and also for a country like Sweden, it has been calculated, which waged war in other countries, mainly in Germany, but nevertheless the Swedish population in the 16th century was heavily decimated by losses of population, namely the soldiers compulsorily recruited for the army in Sweden to go and fight in Germany or in Lithuania. Yes, it has been calculated that in the generation of the 30 Years' War, so between 1618 and 68, up to a quarter of the Swedish male population in the age group from 17 to 50 died at war. A quarter in 30 years. So these effects are a kind of necessity, and people accepted it. Why was the 30 Years' War waged? Was that on demand of the people? Of course not. It was to repress Protestantism in Bohemia that it all started. To repress all monarchical principles, namely that the Bohemians should remain members of the Catholic Church. And, of course, loyal subjects to the House of Habsburg. So, the organization of war strengthens the military organization. And the military power increases between 1500 to 1800 tremendously. The size of the armies triples, and the military technology increases that much, and that all creates military power in the hands of the state, which can crush any revolt within the state borders. So the army can be used not only against foreign enemies, but also the enemies within the country. And that was, of course, the case. I gave the example of troops being sent by the king to convince the assemblies to vote for the taxes. And yeah, a very simple law, and that's the near last word I will say. Yeah, divided interest. The Latin expression divide et impera. There is one king and there are many estates. And it is always difficult, as we saw in the case of the Lombard League in the 12th century, but also in any other situation. The Polish nobility remained divided on the level of the magnates sitting in the Senate. They were split by clan rivalries, and that of course meant the end of the Polish kingdom. And that simple reality that for magnates, just as well as for cities, it was very difficult to come to terms, to collaborate in the same common interest. And it was very easy for a central power to play off one party against the other. And of course, what you all know is that states built up a more efficient power system in the sense of a bureaucracy. So I think it is maybe a negative message, not only negative. Political participation did not win. It lost systematically because if they could express their free will, they asked for peace, not for war. Subjects always asked for peace and law and order. And I mentioned Bissen, who studied, as I said, the emergence of the Cortes of Aragon, the Kingdom of Aragon, and he stressed that very insistently, that the whole peace movement was really launched by the bishops, initially by the church in general, was very central to understand the tendency that the need for law and order needed to be organized by some other than the struggling noblemen. So in that respect, I think, to conclude, really, it is not only in negative sense, in the sense that there was a common memory, even in a country like France, where the States General ceased to mean anything, had no real competences, by the way, and provincial estates were becoming ever more corrupt and part of the system. Nevertheless, at the eve of a revolution in Poland, just as in France or elsewhere, they remembered the possibility of that forum, that platform to express the people's voice. So in that respect, it contributed to the modernization of the political system in Europe. I talked far too long, but there is still, I hope, time for discussion.
How can we explain the divergent path at longue durée from the Middle to the modern age between the Kingdom of France and the Crown of Castilla at one hand and the Kingdom of England and the Principality of Catalonia at the other one, in the sense that the weaker, at the beginning, the weaker kings of France and of Castilla, finally they were able to impose their power over their communities, and in the other hand, two stronger princes, as the King of England and Count of Barcelona, were finally counter-powered, by two stronger parliaments.
I suggest, very briefly, to fill in the boxes here and to observe that the Kingdom of Aragon was composed with at least two metropolises, Barcelona and Valencia, and there was a strong, relatively independent power in the direction of commercial, maritime interest. And yeah, that is not the only explanation, but it is a relevant factor which makes Catalonia more comparable to England, or Kingdom of Aragon more comparable to England, and France more comparable to Castile. So look at the relative weight of the non-rural, non-agrarian, non-noble sector in society, and then you come far. It's not the only factor. I did not really address a factor which I should mention now, namely events in history can't be discarded. I discarded them here, but in my final analysis, I think that events, political accidents, the decisions individual kings could make or not make, the accidents during warfare and all the like, events can have lasting effects. The fact that kings of Aragon invested in conquest, not only on land but also overseas, may have been inspired by three types of interest: dynastic glory, of course, maybe in some parts commercial interests, especially for Mallorca, less so for Sicily, and the third, I forgot. Yes, of course, conquest conquest can offer more returns to the crown. Can. And to the nobility. They settle. And for Barcelona, the conquest of Mallorca was excluding a potential rival. So I think, yeah, I should have mentioned eventual factors which have to do with warfare, but not only that. I did mention it in the context of the 30 Years' War. But yeah, it is a structural element. Monarchs make decisions with effects. And yeah, it's difficult for us sometimes to understand why people accepted while they knew they didn't want the results. And the only conclusion to which I came until now, or the conclusion or the hypothesis I came until now, is that we have to be aware of the fundamental hierarchical way of thinking in pre-industrial societies. They accepted royal power as being granted by God, par la grâce de Dieu. And yeah, it was of course also used against any form of rebellion. Of course, the monarchy used such types of arguments to crush resistance. There's even an example, I have it in my slides, that members of the nobility in Bretagne were imprisoned, put in jail. Yeah, it sounds very present-day history. I will show you the exact data, may be useful in the present situation. They were jailed here. That year, 1752, in Bretagne, a few members of the noble estates in Bretagne were imprisoned or exiled, both forms, because of their protestations against claims for new taxes by the king. And they remained in jail for more than 2 years. And afterwards they were still having a voice in the parliament. But yeah, that is what kings did, and they were empowered to do it. And yeah, at the moment when the Swedish king decides to take the sides of the Protestants in German lands and comes with a strong army with very modern cannon, and the Swedish industry profited from the military investment. The metallurgy was very developed, so there was a collusion there as well, of course. But what could the rural population or the small city urban population do in Germany when the Swedish king came with a modern army of 50,000 people? So they had not the means to resist. They had to take the consequences. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned, it was very interesting talk, and you mentioned the case of England, and we talked about these elections in the 18th century England. But in the Crown of Aragon we had different, for some institutions we had this election, that lottery, sort of lottery election, the tirage à sort. At what point, after checking all these political models you've been looking at what point was it exceptional? And at what point was it, let's say, politically relevant or interesting? Because there was also a cultural, political culture behind the lottery, tirage à sort, insirculació et extracció sort.
Lottery or fortune was a common way of decision making also on a local level in towns in the Middle Ages to choose between candidates for the local magistracy. So people invented ways to avoid corruption, very different ways, and yeah, in different instances. What seems to me unique in the English case is the fact that counties, which remained the basis of the political organization and the organization of these elections in towns and in counties, that was a system which was created in the 11th century already. The very early administrative and judicial organization of the Kingdom of England is unique in the history of European state formation, and in that respect, that tradition, also including the system of peace, not imposed by bishops, but on the basis of judges of peace, who were voluntaries in the community. That system of voluntary participation not in the political, but in the judicial role of the state, goes back to the High Middle Ages in England. Again, a tradition which helps to understand that the parliamentary system could function within that very solid and very old framework, a judicial framework, but also a financial one. The exchequer as a central treasury also was a system functioning very well and efficiently, thanks to the occupation by the Normans. So occupation is here the central explanatory factor to understand the early, centralizing judicial, fiscal, and in a derivative term, political system in England. And only there. It did not work in that way in France. France did have bailliage and senéchals, but not on a similar basis. Earlier explanations by Myers, by the way, the same author with whom I started, in explaining why the States General failed in France as compared to England, all the explanations referred to cultural differences between North and South in France, and including legal differences, including the role of notaries and Latin and so on, but also the sheer size of the country. France is, in the size of the country, even, it depends on the period, of course, but in 1500, France is 5 times the size of England. That makes a difference in the functioning of communication, and politics rests on communication. So, but yeah, the introduction by conquest of a unified system, administrative system in England, is really one of the explanatory factors which facilitated the participatory role of subjects. Yeah, I've not been thinking about it. Thank you for bringing your idea. We still have a few minutes. Eh?
Thank you very much.
I have to take it, but...
Yeah, well, looking at the situation in England and the monarchy at the present time, would you say that instead of armies of soldiers, monarchies now use armies of PR consultants in order to retain any semblance of authority they have and power.
I missed the last sentence.
No, would you say that in the past you were talking about monarchs and they have armies there to fight for their cause? Now it seems they have armies of public relations experts. Certainly that's my perception of what happens in what's happening in the UK.
Yeah. We are talking about present day. I'm not an expert, so
no
voice is just as heavy as mine. But you see that governments are prepared to use their army. The American president threatens to use it. The Hungarian prime minister used it recently. The French presidents would be prepared to do it at any case. In any way, they mobilized the armies after the terrorist attacks in France and Belgium as well. And I came this morning by the airport and there were still soldiers in the airport, but in France that has been the case constantly. So, no. But indeed, if peasants in any region of France or Germany would rise because of any measure, tax measure the European Union might decide to take and harming a particular sector of their industry or trade, I'm sure that the army will be mobilized. Yeah. But yeah, I was struck by the fact that it was used against the representative institution of which a king of France had sworn to respect the privileges by accessing the inauguration oath. Also the King of France, Louis XIV, the inauguration oath, or the oaths of incorporation of a territory newly acquired, such as the Dauphiné or the Provence, or the latest in the succession, Lotharingia, they were always incorporated in the kingdom with respect for their established privileges, and the promise, such as in the case of some of the provinces also here in the Kingdom of Aragon, to keep the promise made by their predecessors to meet Parliament or the Cortes every year. They promise it and then they forget it, and nobody protests. And that's again, that element, it's another generalization maybe. I made a difference between the possibility of a center to play against a divided opponent, but there is also the general opposition between executive power, which is permanent and always in an advantage position as compared to those representatives who have a voice but are not specialized, not professionals, meeting every now and then, maybe every week, but not daily. And you see, if it may be the European Commission as against the European Parliament, it is a general law, I think, in political science, that the executive has the advantage against the representative.
Very quickly, before you have said to the elections, to the all elections to the English Parliament, the elections were not every Parliament but every large session of Parliament?
Per session, yes, but the session of Parliament could last half a year. And the king had to summon Parliament, but a meeting of the Parliament could really last months. And in that respect, the size of the country led to a formula which was not reached for the French Estates General. They could solve the problem of distance and traveling and so on by remaining together for a longer period. That happened also in other situations. I I've seen the documents about the Parliament of Sardinia, not the most participative institution, by the way, but they also met for years sometimes, because they could hardly come to decisions, and then they went on in committees and so on. But the English Parliament really met during months, a year, normally. And that started in the 15th century in that way. It went on. But for each new summons, there were letters sent individually to the barons and then to the institutions, the counties, and the boroughs.
After a very prorogation.
To nominate, yeah, the barons were nominatively invited, the lords to the House of Lords, and the bishops, of course, and the counties and the boroughs had to elect people. The election in the boroughs, the towns, took place within urban assemblies.
Thank you very much.
I'm grateful for the opportunity you gave me to think about this and to be among you.